afternoon. This is a small town talk. And what we're going to do today is a little bit different. It may be more structured than usual, which is kind of a change for me. And what I'm going to do is go into a synopsis of the town, how it was founded, but more than what it was founded as a town, how it was settled really as a nation in a sense, because the Pilgrims are the ones that get credit for this. So I'll go into a little bit of small talk on that. Then I will do, in a discombobulated way, I'm sorry to say to you and your family, I'll take certain sections out of the actual history of the Pilgrims and a young man named King Philip. And so that will be a little kabobbled, and I apologize, because I will be taking different sections out of it that I've overlined many years ago, because this is nothing new, history, obviously. First of all, before I forget it, though, I want to get into the fact that it will end if I get to the end. If not, it'll end the next show. The 3 schools, we're in one of them, that's called the South. And the town was settled in 1731, and that's when the schools were established, 3 different sections. They were originally operated either out of houses or things of that nature. And the reason that we broke away from Taunton is fairly simple, was the fact that in those days, of course, they didn't have a method of transportation, and so therefore most people walked to where they were going. And so when Taunton was originally formed, back in the day of the Pilgrims, Raynham was a section of that community. And so as we broke off, it was because of the fact to attend church, the citizens would have to walk from their community, which would be the south, the center, and the north, to the church that day and then back. And they would lose the whole day, and that really wasn't their complaint. It was the fact that it was very cumbersome to do this, but we will get involved in a little bit of that. So I'm going to start off of notes, which I usually don't do, but that does somewhat keep me under the structure of it all. Now, most people are aware that Plymouth was the original founding of the founding fathers in the United States, which originally was the colonies. And of course they were wrong, and you know they were wrong, don't you? Because it wasn't Plymouth, it was Provincetown. And Provincetown is at the very end of the Cape. And so therefore, when the Pilgrims came to a piece of land, they settled it, and they moved into it, what we now call Provincetown. And they didn't stay very long. It wasn't hospitable. It was not the type of town that you settle because of the nature coming at them. They were right at the tip of the Cape, which you know that now, don't you? And so Provincetown wasn't what they considered inhabitable to them. So what they did was they got back in their little boats, and they went on to try to find the next. And it is, those who you say it settled in Plymouth, at least on the second you were correct, they settled in a neighborhood called Plymouth. Now, in meeting it, though, the Native Americans for that particular way who greeted them didn't live in Plymouth at all. As a matter of fact, if you go to Plymouth and talk to the Native Americans, they'd say, "Who'd settled here?" But the Pilgrims did. And they were greeted then by Massasoit, who was the Native American that greeted them at the port and treated them well. But Massasoit didn't live in Plymouth. He lived in 2 other sections, which I'll give you now, well, what we call them. The first was in Rhode Island, in Mount Hope. That basically was, I'm going to call it, their home. And the other one, the other section they lived, was in a little section of the city of Taunton, which the Tauntonians call Raynham. and it was up in an area where there was a body of water, and that is where they spent their winters because of the protection it gave them from the winters. And Mount Hope, of course, was on the water, as was Plymouth. And they were places that normally, without the current sort of protection you have today, it would be best you didn't live in those communities. But of course the Pilgrims didn't know any better, and so they did. And so anyway, we will also, I will, out of our little historical document, which is historically correct, by the way, tell you about Thanksgiving, which isn't something which you think about today. And I think you know that, though. The Fowl Pond was the name of the Raynham location, which I will go into later on again. King Philip was the son. His name, Native American name, was Metacomb. And Metacomb was the young son of Massasoit. And the eldest son, the Pilgrims, we don't know, and maybe there's somewhere else where they'll get more involved in the history, whether they did it as a joke, for fun, whatever you want to call it. They gave the two sons, I guess we'll call it, nicknames. And so they called Metacomb King Philip. And he liked that because he had heard that back where they came from, they were kings. And Andrew, the elder brother, was called King Andrews. So each one was called a king, which they really got kind of a kick out of that, and it kind of meant something to them. The problem that occurred, now I'm going to get a little bit in real structure here. As the Native Americans lived in Mount Hope, the reason that Massasoit formed a bond with the Pilgrims was the fact that he was having trouble with the other tribes. They were stronger than he was, and they put him in a position that wasn't favorable to his tribe. So as a result, he bonded somewhat with the Pilgrims, who had weapons and things of that nature that were more powerful, certainly, than the Native Americans had at that time. And so when they would come up from Mount Hope, they would attempt to teach the Pilgrims on how to farm and how to survive. And even then, with all the work that Massasoit did to help the Pilgrims, half of the Pilgrims died the first year. To give you an idea of the climate of that particular area. It's still that way, by the way. But we have what we call heat in the homes and things of that nature. So, anyway, Philip and Matthew and Massasoit bonded with the Native American. That was the good news. The bad news is, I'm going to use the term the white men just to distinguish. You know what I'm talking about when I say that, the Pilgrims. The white man brought diseases with them. And what happens in life as these new groups come with new illnesses, if you will, the group they meet don't have protection against it because they didn't have that. So as a result of that, the Pilgrims lost many because of illness, but also Native Americans, unfortunately for them, got the illness from the Native Americans to the white man, and so there was a large number of Native Americans losing their life. They were dying as a result of this, and this weakened the tribe so that other tribes became stronger than them. So for this, Massasoit tried his best to bond with the white man who had some weapons that he didn't have. I'm going to give you a name now. You historians in the town know this very well. As a matter of fact, there are descendants of that name still living in the town of Raynham. Years ago, the Raynham Board of Selectmen had an executive secretary named Barbara Sleezer, but her maiden name was Barbara Leonard. She was known then as Barbara Leonard Sleezer, and she was a direct descendant of the Leonard family. James Leonard came over to this area. We'll go into that maybe someday. If I start now, I won't stop. So Mr. Leonard, James Leonard, came over with his family and his brother, and they had come off of an area of England where they worked in what we called in those days, and maybe we do now too, the ironworks. And the original ironworks in the colonies, I believe, was Swampscott, but it wasn't successful. So the ironworks that started in the colonies was not in Raynham, but we lay claim to the fact that the original ironworks was successful in the town of Raynham because it lasted several hundred years, the Leonard Ironworks. For those of you in Raynham, driving down South Main Street, going to, say, a softball game or towards Route 44 in the city of Taunton, after you hit a little funny little street called Richmond Street on the left. On the left right after that, you will notice there's an anchor. Well, this was brought here originally by George B. Miller brought it up. Arthur Pillsbury mounted it in a parade, and so it was placed in the area, in the general area of the original successful ironworks in the colony, therefore in the United States. One of our claims to fame. Of course, what people don't know, and you're going to learn today, is that Fowl Pond was where the Native Americans who welcomed the Pilgrims lived during the winter. That was their winter home. Fishing, it was just a maze of nature's gifts in Fowl Pond, which today is just about disappeared into what we like to call nowadays swamp. The reason we bring up the Leonard family, and I will go into it at some other date a little bit more, because war resulted eventually. What occurred was that the Native Americans and the, quote, white men, close quote, began to run into a problem. I will try to be brief, which isn't me, as you know, but I'll try to be brief and explain that as the white man obtained a different land from the Native American, they thought they were purchasing it in a fashion. And because they gave nothing for it, they thought it was a gift. But the Native Americans, what we call now the Indians had a different definition. And this is why we will get involved a little bit, and if I get onto it, I apologize too much. But government, quite candidly, is about something called power. It's power over the land. And power over the land leads to power over people. And what happened with the Native Americans was when they gave the rights to the land to the white men, they surrounded it with stone walls. You may see many of these stone walls still existing in the town of Raynham. And so they were built for the white man to make it its territory. But to the Native Americans, when they, I'll use the word gifted loosely, to the white man, land for them to farm and whatever they wanted to do, they came and they said they wanted a certain sections, and the Native Americans said, sure. But what the Native Americans believed was was that land was occupied, I'll use the word currently for ourselves, was controlled by God. And the Lord Native Americans had a sense of that spiritual gift, if you will, believed that land didn't belong to any person. It belonged to, it was in the purview of the religious group of, say, it was God's land. So when the white man gained the land, they thought that was their land now. They thought in a structural government way they could deed it, they could sell it, and do whatever. And of course, the Native Americans didn't even have any idea what they were talking about because it wasn't theirs. And as time went by and land became more gifted, and the Native Americans began to realize that the land that the white man had obtained, they thought was theirs. The Native Americans tried to explain to the white man the definition of land in their world. And of course, the white man tried to explain to the Native American definition in their world, and it wasn't the same. And so when it got to a point where the Native Americans realized that they owned or had gifted away so much land that they no longer had authority over their tribal area, they began to dispute it. And one word led to another, didn't it? Well, here's the thing that the Native Americans had originally in common with the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims came from England, where the king had the throne, and then there were knights and all that, and so they knew what their structure was. And what the structure basically was that the Native American elders succeeded. And just recently, for you who are current, don't get me going, but in Japan, the emperor stepped down for the first time in hundreds of years and deeded it to his son to become the emperor of Japan. So even in many of, and of course, the Native Americans are descendants of the Asians. And so the gain of the elders would be that what they called King Andrew would succeed Massasoit. Well, Massasoit, of course, passed on. And with Andrew, there was a charge, if you will, that Andrew had killed a member of the colony in the Mount Hope area, though, in Rhode Island. And it was controversial, and historians will explain it to you someday if you care. But Philip was asked, not Philip, but Andrew was asked to come to Plymouth to face a trial. Well, of course, he didn't have any idea what they were talking about, but he thought he'd go up and hear them out anyway. Did he kill the person or did he not? Well, you and I don't know, do we? But anyway, that was he was accused of that. And in a fashion, in the white man's method, he was convicted of that. But he never understood what in the world they were talking about and didn't pay any attention to them anyway. So and then he decided to go home. It was time for he and his wife to go home. And of course, in those days, when you went from Plymouth to Mount Hope in Rhode Island, you didn't do that even a day, did you? So therefore, you came by way of what now we call Route 44. And Andrew and his wife and tribal group that came with him settled down on the shores of what is now called the Taunton River. And the Taunton River is still there, isn't it? It's a fairly good-sized river to this day. And so Philip, his bride, and his tribal group with him, going back to Mount Hope, settled down for the night. And the next day, Andrew didn't wake up. He had died during the evening. And here is the Jan version of it, if you will. Philip believed that his brother was poisoned by the pilgrims, that he had been found guilty of this violation, and Philip and the tribe believed that Philip was poisoned and died of poison. Well, there were no autopsies or anything of that nature. So they took it that is what happened to Andrew. And in his dying, of course, this now suddenly enters into the white man's world, doesn't it? Because Philip, being the youngest son, was not trained to be the chief of a tribe. His brother was trained to be the chief of the tribe. So suddenly Philip was in charge. So Philip did the best he could, it is alleged, and became the chief of the Wampanoags and settled in as chief of the tribe. And it was not a happy relationship because he felt the pilgrims had murdered his brother. And so as he settled in, he did the best he could to bond together with one of the white men, and wouldn't you know, in the two towns he lived, Mount Hope in the summer and the general part of the year, and then in the winter in a little section of Taunton called Raynham. He bonded with a young man named James Leonard, which we just talked about. You remember that, you got your notes. And so he had James Leonard fix many of his weapons, and being the ironworks, Leonard was proficient at that, and Leonard and he became close friends. As a result, when the King Philip War started, it is going to come to pass that the largest number of inhabitants of our nation as we knew it then, the largest number of people were killed in that war than any war since the founding of the United States, because obviously wars after that were military and off on foreign soils and things of that nature. So the Native Americans did murder more, what we called in those days, more white men than ever in the history of this country. And so the King Philip War started in around Taunton, Plymouth, in that general area, and it resulted as a problem between the claim of land. And also, of course, it didn't help any that they murdered his brother, did it? And so as the King Philip War, and by the way, Philip was never in favor of that, and but basically other groups within the tribe said to be honored, he really had to go to war, and he did. But he wasn't trained to be a warrior, and he did the best he could with what he had. And the tribes, however, moved out in this war. This war, King Philip, if you look it up, went up to Maine. It diversified over, and so many of the pilgrims, if we call them, might as well call them that this week, right? Many of the pilgrims were murdered during this, and they were in the combat portion of it. The military was formed out of the remnants of the villages, of which one of the villages, and remember this now, in those days there were no cities. All of the various communities were towns, and Taunton was a town, and Taunton formed a military along with other villages, if you will, to fight the Native Americans to settle this once and forever, what was going to happen, and to get this thing resolved. And so as the fight evolved, Johnny Welsh and I, you know, Deacon John, for those who know him, who is Raynham's storyteller, went down to Lakeville. And in Lakeville, we met with what is called the last James Leonard. He has since passed, and I don't know of any direct descendants of the Leonard family that has placed itself into this situation where James Leonard in Lakeville at that time, and he gave John and I, what is called oral history, and told us basically the Leonard side of the story. The Leonards got, you might say, some bad press as a result of this, because it was considered that the white men in the Raynham area, which would have been in the area of Fowl Pond, and also in the area of the Leonard Ironworks, didn't have the same problem with losing lives and losing real estate as did the rest of the colonies. So King Philip pretty much took on all of the colony area, and basically one version would be of the white man that James Leonard repaired weapons and maintained that for the Native Americans. So it became a little bit bad public relations, you might say, for by the way, we were Tauntonians at that time. And so that part of Taunton, where the Native Americans lived, and where King Philip and his family and other white people in that particular area lived, they became somewhat. Now, let me give you the version which you do not see in written, I believe, at this time, for the King Philip War. What King Philip did was he met with James Leonard. By the way, they were neighbors. If you're familiar with Richmond Street, which I certainly am, and you come down South Main and you take a left onto Richmond Street, you'll see that there becomes a fork in the road which is called Warren Street. And it's only in recent years that that's been paved, and now it's become a shortcut, because that's another story for another day. But that particular area is where the original church was for the founding of Raynham. And in that particular area of just the function there of Warren Street, James Leonard lived. But also, we talked about the Fowl Pond, and that was basically considered by the Native Americans their neighborhood. And so that's the neighborhood that King Philip came from. And so what he said to James Leonard was that he would guarantee the Raynham area that they would have one of two things burnt down. Because in those days, when they took charge of you, they would burn your house and burn your barn. Now, your question was, in those days, what was the most important? Quite candidly, it was the barn. So, because that's where the farmers kept all their equipment and things of that nature, and storage of their supplies. So, when King Philip's War broke out, people found out that in many areas in the town of Raynham, there was either a house burnt, but not the barn, or the barn burned, not the house, because the people had their choice and let James Leonard know which they were. They tried to protect both, but if it could be one, then that is what was left by the Raynhamites in those days. Well, this has been the oral presentation of the history of the town of Raynham up to this point when it was Fowl Pond. And we will go into the next broadcast, which we're now 1/2 hour show, of course, and we will give you some of the written version of the founding of the Pilgrims and the Raynham area and all, in the historically written area, and we will take care of that. Thank you very much for your attention on what we consider the beginning. It's a 2-part series. It will be over this facet of it in our next show. Thank you very much for watching. I remain, what's his name?